The ballroom glittered as though the stars themselves had fallen into the chandeliers. Gold light rippled across gowns, mirrors, and polished marble, while violins spun through the air like a web meant to catch every secret and shame. Among the radiance stood Lady Evelina Harbury, a woman of 23 summers, her poise as deliberate as the stitching on her ivory gloves. She smiled with restraint, the kind that fools the inattentive, but behind that serene composure, humiliation was tightening like a ribbon around her throat. Her former betrothed, Lord Cedric Ashbourne, lounged near the refreshment table with the arrogance of a man who had never known the ache of consequence. His laughter carried, buoyed by champagne and vanity. "Not married yet?" he said, loud enough for half the assembly to hear. "I fear Miss Harbury's devotion to her books has frightened off the living." His companions chuckled, though some looked uneasy, aware that such cruelty would cling to him like a stain. But in that instant society's cruelty was not aimed at him, it was aimed at her. The whispers fluttered like silk fans. Poor creature, unwed at 23, always reading, never seen. Evelina's fingers tightened around her glass. She did not look at Cedric, for looking would mean surrender. Instead, she lifted her chin and turned her gaze toward the great gilt mirrors, where her reflection seemed distant, paler, lonelier, almost ghostly beneath the shimmer of crystal. There was no saving one's reputation once mockery had been christened by gossip. Yet she held her posture like armor, replying to a nearby lady's polite inquiry with calm precision, her voice steady as a piano note struck by habit, not by heart. The orchestra began a waltz. Cedric swept his new fiancée, an heiress with ringlets of perfect gold, into the center of the floor. Every movement of his dance was a performance of victory. Evelina felt the room close around her, perfumed and airless, until she could hardly breathe. At last she slipped through the archway and onto the terrace, where night air licked the tears from her lashes before they could fall. London stretched before her, spires and chimneys under a restless drizzle. The rain made a gentle sound against the marble balustrade, a sound that seemed to understand her better than any voice in that room. For a moment she allowed herself to tremble. Not from heartbreak, she was far beyond that, but from the weariness of enduring cruelty with dignity. She thought of how her father, once a scholar of languages, had raised her on philosophy and poetry instead of fortune and flirtation. He taught her that reason was a woman's fortress. Yet in this world, wit was a liability. Society did not mind cleverness so long as it came wrapped in silence. A shadow moved near the doorway, Lady Beatrice, her oldest friend, eyes soft with pity. "You needn't let him wound you, Eve," she whispered. "His cruelty is only proof of how small he feels beside you." Evelina smiled faintly, but the gesture was brittle. "Small men often cast the longest shadows," she murmured. The words came out not bitter but weary, like a truth long known. When she returned to the ballroom, the candles had burned lower, their flames flickering like nervous hearts. She danced once, out of courtesy, then withdrew early, her carriage rattling through wet streets to the modest townhouse that had been her mother's dowry. Inside, the fire was low, the servants asleep, and the quiet so profound it seemed to hum. She undressed alone, setting aside her pearl combs and the wilted roses pinned to her bodice. Then she sat by the fire and stared at her reflection in the mirror above the mantel, a face pale but resolute, with eyes that had learned not to beg for kindness. From the corner of the room came a soft sound, the creak of the mail slot. Evelina rose and crossed the carpet. A sealed envelope lay upon the floor, its wax crest bearing the image of a rampant lion crowned with ivy. She frowned, for she knew that insignia, the House of Wintreshire. Carefully she broke the seal and unfolded the letter, its parchment scented faintly of cedar and rain. "Madam, your reputation for intellect precedes you. I seek a tutor of rare discernment for my nephew, recently orphaned and in need of both education and compassion. The appointment would be at Wintreshire Hall. Your discretion will be appreciated. Alexander Whitestone, Duke of Wintreshire." Her breath caught. The Duke of Wintreshire was spoken of with reverence and unease. A man of 38, veteran of Waterloo, widower, rumored recluse. It was said that even Parliament hesitated before his gaze. Why would such a man seek her, a woman branded undesirable by the ton? She read the letter twice, her fingertips tracing the ink as though it might vanish. Something in the phrasing drew her, its lack of condescension, its strange respect. Still she hesitated. A single woman living under a duke's roof invited ruinous speculation. The same tongues that mocked her tonight would tear her apart tomorrow. Yet what else awaited her here? Days measured by gossip, nights haunted by Cedric's laughter, the slow suffocation of potential. By morning she had made her choice. When the carriage arrived, mist rolled along the cobblestones like memory made visible. Evelina stood on the threshold in a plain traveling cloak, her only companion a leather case of books. Her maid fretted about the impropriety, she only smiled. "A woman may live without affection," she said softly, "but not without purpose." As the coach clattered away from London, she watched the city's rooftops dissolve into grey. Somewhere behind her, Cedric was likely recounting her humiliation over breakfast, pouring cream into his tea as though nothing were amiss. He would not notice her absence, not yet. But in the soft light of dawn, as the road unfurled like a new chapter, Evelina felt something shift inside her. Not vengeance, not pride, but quiet defiance. Rain streaked the windows, blurring hedgerows and milestones into watercolor. She pressed her palm to the cold glass, whispering a silent vow that she would never again measure her worth by a man's approval. The carriage wheels struck a rut, jolting her from thought, and she laughed under her breath at the absurdity of it all. How life could pivot on a single insult, a single letter, a single moment of resolve. Hours later, when the clouds broke and sunlight spilled over the countryside, she drew the letter once more from her satchel. Beneath the Duke's signature was a faint impression, a smudge of ink where his hand had hesitated before sealing it. For reasons she could not name, that imperfection felt like a promise. She folded the letter carefully and tucked it into her bodice, close to her heart. Outside, the road curved toward the unseen north. Ahead lay marble corridors, cold firelight, and a man whose name could silence Parliament itself. Evelina did not know whether fate meant to redeem her or destroy her. But as the coach crested the final hill and the spires of Wintreshire appeared through the veil of fog, her pulse quickened, not from fear but from the rare, forbidden thrill of beginning again. The carriage wound its way through a mist-shrouded valley, the wheels murmuring over the damp earth. Wintreshire Hall emerged from the fog like something dreamt by a poet, all stone majesty and shadow, its towers rising above a forest that breathed silence. Evelina felt the air change as she crossed its gates, colder, older, as if the house itself regarded her with wary intelligence. When the coach halted, she gathered her composure, adjusting her bonnet with hands that trembled despite herself. A footman opened the door. His bow was courteous but measured, the sort of politeness reserved for those whose rank was uncertain. Inside, the entrance hall stretched vast and austere, lined with ancestral portraits. The air smelled faintly of rain and lavender polish. A great clock ticked somewhere above, counting the moments until her fate revealed itself. The Duke appeared at the far end of the corridor. He was not what she had imagined. No powdered, perfumed nobleman, but a tall figure dressed in dark wool, his shoulders squared as though still bearing command. A faint scar cut across his left temple, vanishing into hair touched by premature silver. His eyes, gray, stormlit, unreadable, regarded her not as a curiosity but as an equation he intended to solve. "Miss Harbury," he said, his voice quiet but carrying. "You are prompt. Few in London would travel so far for employment." "I have little fondness for London of late, Your Grace," she replied. Her tone was courteous, though the words carried an edge he did not miss. A shadow of amusement, or perhaps relief, passed over his features. "Then we are in agreement. London has little fondness for me either." He gestured for her to follow. The hallways were lined with ancient tapestries and echoing footsteps. She sensed in him the weight of solitude, a man accustomed to command yet estranged from comfort. The household staff moved quietly around him, deferential but distant. Even the portraits seemed to shrink in his presence. At last they entered a study overlooking the gardens, a room softened by books and the crackle of a low fire. Upon the hearth sat a boy of 10, hair tousled, gaze bright and suspicious. "Henry," the Duke said, his tone shifting to one almost human. "This is Miss Harbury. She will instruct you in Latin, history, and I expect patience." The child tilted his head. "She doesn't look like a governess." "No," the Duke said, watching her carefully, "she does not." Evelina smiled despite her nerves. "That may prove an advantage, Master Henry. I am less likely to bore you to tears." The boy grinned, and the Duke turned away, concealing what might have been approval. Days slipped into a rhythm. Mornings filled with lessons in the library, Latin verbs mingling with birdsong and the tick of the old clock. Henry's curiosity bloomed under her guidance. He had his uncle's sharp mind but not his restraint. Questions tumbled from him like marbles on a floor. She admired his spirit and pitied his loneliness. At night, she often glimpsed the Duke passing through the corridor, stopping to listen outside the library door as she read aloud. He never entered, but once, when she turned unexpectedly, their eyes met through the lamplight. He inclined his head and moved on wordless. The servants whispered that the Duke had not danced nor smiled since the war. His betrothed had died waiting for him, her letters found unopened after Waterloo. Evelina did not seek gossip, but grief lingered here like perfume on old lace. The very walls seemed to breathe his silence. One afternoon rain kept them indoors. Henry begged her to play the pianoforte. She hesitated. Her father's music lessons belonged to a past life, but his pleading eyes left no room for refusal. Her fingers found the keys, hesitant at first, then sure, weaving a melody both tender and sorrowful. When the final note faded, a quiet voice from the doorway said, "Beethoven's Sonata No. 8. You play as though you have known loss." The Duke stood there, one hand resting on the doorframe. She rose quickly, embarrassed by his gaze. "Only longing, your grace." "That is worse," he murmured. Then, before she could reply, he turned and left. The next morning she found a small parcel on her desk. Within lay a rare edition of Plato's Dialogues, bound in deep green leather. No note, only the Duke's seal pressed into wax. The gesture sent warmth and unease through her chest, an acknowledgment too personal for mere gratitude, too restrained for affection. She placed the book aside, but her hands lingered upon it longer than propriety allowed. By week's end the household had changed. The servants' whispers sharpened. Her arrival was no longer a curiosity but a subject of scrutiny. She heard fragments in the corridor. "The tutor dines with his grace, he walks the gardens when she reads, they say he smiles now." Gossip, she knew, was the currency of the idle, yet even the most idle rumor could ruin. That evening, as dusk painted the halls amber, she found the Duke in the library, standing by the fire. "Your Grace," she began, "I fear my presence may invite misunderstanding." He did not look at her. "Misunderstanding from whom?" "From everyone who delights in malice." "You are a man of position." "I am." "Of intelligence," he interrupted, turning toward her. "And courage. Do not let fools reduce you to station." His voice was gentle, but something in it struck deeper than praise. She met his gaze fully, and for the first time he did not look away. "You mistake my concern for weakness," she said softly. "But a woman's reputation is as fragile as glass. Once cracked, no apology mends it." He studied her for a long moment, then spoke as though to himself. "Then let us give them something true to talk about." Her breath caught. He moved closer, not with the intent of impropriety, but with the calm certainty of a man who had ceased to fear scandal. "You have brought light into a place long resigned to shadow, Miss Harbury. Let the world say what it will. I have learned that silence is a far crueler companion than rumor." Before she could reply, the door opened, a maid, pale, holding a folded newspaper. "Forgive me, your Grace," she stammered. "This was just delivered from London." The Duke took it, scanning the front page. His jaw tightened. Without a word he passed it to Evelina. There, beneath the society column, the headline gleamed like a blade. "The Duke of Wintroshire's new fascination, a blue-stocking tutor in the countryside." Her vision blurred for an instant, then cleared. Beneath the headline, lines dripped with mockery, her name paired with words like unseemly and intimate companionship. Cedric's name appeared briefly, quoted for some careless jest. The insult echoed that first night in London, only sharper now, honed by ink and gossip. Evelina's voice was quiet when she spoke. "I have cost you your peace." The Duke's answer came low, unwavering. "Peace is for men who no longer live. And I have only just begun again." The fire cracked, scattering sparks across the hearth like startled stars. Evelina folded the paper, her pulse trembling against her gloves. Somewhere deep within, humiliation warred with something far more dangerous, the first stirring of affection she could no longer disguise. Outside, thunder rolled across the fields as if the heavens themselves disapproved. She turned toward the window, uncertain whether the storm was coming or already here. The storm had not yet broken, but the sky hung heavy with its promise. For 3 days the house had lived beneath its waiting weight, doors shut, air close, tempers muted. Even the servants walked softer, as though their footsteps might summon lightning. Evelina felt the tension in every corridor, each breath measured against the silence that now existed between her and the Duke. Since the newspaper's cruel words had traveled from London, she had spoken to him only when necessity demanded. And even then the air trembled with the unsaid. She had wanted to leave. The morning after the scandal, she had written her resignation and folded it neatly beside her teacup, intending to deliver it before breakfast. But when she saw young Henry waiting in the library, eager to begin his lessons as if nothing had changed, her resolve faltered. He was too young to understand the venom of gossip, too gentle to be punished for it. So she stayed, for his sake, she told herself, though the truth hid deeper. The Duke had made no attempt to dissuade her. Nor had he spoken of the article again. Yet each evening she sensed him watching from the shadowed gallery as she played the pianoforte or read aloud by the fire. It was not intrusion but a quiet guardianship, a wordless acknowledgement of their shared disgrace. Still, shame gnawed at her like hunger. On the fourth night, the heavens finally gave way. Rain swept across the valley in fierce sheets, drumming against the glass like a warning. Thunder rolled through the hills and the house seemed to exhale at last. Evelina stood by the tall window of the music room, watching lightning crawl over the moors. The storm's fury mirrored her heart, restless, uncontained. She did not hear the Duke enter until his reflection joined hers in the windowpane. "You are awake late, Miss Harbury?" "I could say the same, Your Grace," she replied softly. He moved closer, the firelight catching in the silver threads of his hair. "Sleep and I have been strangers for some years." Evelina turned toward him. "Battlefields or memories?" His mouth curved faintly without mirth. "Are they not the same?" The rain lashed harder. A gust flung open a shutter, scattering candlelight across the floor. He stepped forward, securing it with one gloved hand, and for a moment they stood near enough that she felt the heat of him through the storm's chill. "I have dishonored your name," she said quietly, forcing the words she had rehearsed a dozen times. "I cannot remain here, not when every whisper in London—" He cut her off, not with anger but a weary gentleness. "London does not concern me." "But it should," she insisted, voice trembling. "It governs reputation and reputation governs everything. You may not fear scandal but I must live with it. I will not be your ruin." He looked at her then, really looked as though seeing not the tutor, nor the woman shaped by rumor, but something rarer beneath it. "You mistake the matter," he said. "It is not you who risk ruin. It is I who found in you a measure of peace the world forbids me." The words landed between them like thunder. Evelina drew back, her pulse unsteady. "You speak of gratitude, perhaps. Compassion." "I speak of neither." His gaze did not waver. "I speak of a loneliness that ended when you walked into my hall." For a long moment the storm filled the silence they could not. She wanted to answer, but language deserted her. She had built her life upon restraint, upon intellect and self-command. Yet now, every rule she had ever followed felt fragile as glass beneath his voice. When she finally spoke, her tone was steady though her hands were not. "Do you realize what they would call me if they heard you speak thus?" His reply was quiet, almost tender. "They have called you worse already. And yet, you remain unbroken." She turned away, unable to bear the weight of his regard. "Strength is not the same as safety, Your Grace. Nor does admiration erase consequence." He took a step closer, enough for his words to brush the air near her ear. "Then let consequence come. I am long acquainted with ghosts." Lightning flared, illuminating his face, the scar, the grief, the strange mercy in his eyes. For the first time she saw him not as the Duke, not as the symbol of her salvation or peril, but as a man stripped bare by life. The sight undid her. "I should go," she whispered, though her feet did not move. "Where will you go?" he asked. "Anywhere," she said. "Someplace untouched by scandal." He exhaled softly. "There is no such place in England." She met his eyes, and for an instant the world seemed suspended, the storm, the years, the judgment of all mankind. Then the boy's voice pierced the stillness. "Uncle." "Miss Harbury." Henry stood in the doorway, pale with fright. The lightning struck the stables. Both moved at once. The corridor filled with running footsteps, the smell of smoke sharp in the air. Outside, the storm raged with unholy brilliance. Servants shouted, buckets clattered, and sparks danced in the wind. Evelina seized her skirts and followed the Duke through the rain, heedless of propriety or fear. They reached the stables as flames licked the roof beams. Horses neighed in panic. Without hesitation, the Duke plunged into the smoke, cutting ropes, driving the animals toward the open field. Evelina ran to assist, coughing, guiding the terrified boy back to safety. Her gown clung to her, soaked and heavy, her lungs burning with ash. When the last horse bolted free, the roof collapsed with a roar. The Duke emerged moments later, covered in soot, one arm bleeding where a splinter had struck. Evelina ran to him, catching his sleeve. "You're hurt, sit down please." He shook his head, breathless. "Nothing grave." But when she tried to pull him toward the house, his strength faltered. Without thinking, she wrapped her arms around him to steady him, the rain washing blood from his sleeve. Their eyes met again, closer this time, no distance left for decorum to hide behind. "Do you see now," he said hoarsely, "why I cannot let you leave? There are moments in which one truth outweighs all the lies of society." Her heart thudded against his chest. "And what truth is that?" "That I am alive only in your presence." For a heartbeat she could not breathe. Rain cascaded between them, the fire dying to embers behind. Then she stepped back, shaking her head, though tears mingled with the rain upon her cheeks. "You must not say such things. I have nothing to offer but ruin." He smiled faintly, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Then let it ruin us both." The words echoed long after the storm quieted. When dawn came, Wintreshire lay veiled in mist, the wreckage of the stables smoldering in silence. Evelina stood at her window, watching smoke curl toward the pale horizon. The letter she had written weeks ago, her resignation, still rested in the drawer. She opened it, poised to seal it once and for all. Yet as she looked down, she noticed the ink had bled in the night's damp air, her name dissolving into unreadable blue. She set it aside, unable to summon another. In the courtyard below, the Duke appeared, his arm bandaged, his posture unbroken. He glanced once toward her window as if aware she watched, then turned away into the fog. Evelina pressed her palm to the glass. Her heart knew what her mind refused, that she was already lost to him, and London would not forgive it. London glimmered beneath a veil of frost and scandal. 3 months had passed since the night the storm consumed the stables of Wintreshire, but the story that survived was not one of courage, it was of impropriety. The newspapers had fed on rumor like carrion birds, painting Evelina Harbury as the fallen tutor who ensnared a grieving duke. Invitations ceased, acquaintances vanished. When she returned to the city, alone, cloaked in plain grey wool, the silence that greeted her in drawing rooms was louder than gossip itself. She had taken a modest post as companion to the Dowager Countess of Alnwick, a woman too deaf and self-absorbed to notice that her new attendant had once been the subject of scandal. Each morning Evelina poured tea, arranged letters, and recited poetry in a voice emptied of emotion. Each evening she walked alone through Hyde Park, where the fog hung low and memories refused to fade. She told herself it was better this way, better to endure quiet humiliation than the agony of hope. Still, every now and then she imagined the Duke's voice, low, unhurried like the turning of a page, and felt the ache of something unfinished. She had not written to him, nor he to her. Yet she could not forget that final look in the courtyard mist, his eyes unguarded, his soul laid bare. She carried it like a forbidden relic. Winter deepened. London's season began anew, bright with laughter she could not share. The Countess, eager for attention, insisted Evelina accompany her to the royal ball at St. James's Palace, a celebration of peace after war, a display of England's restored grandeur. Evelina resisted, but duty was obedience, and obedience, she had learned, was safety. The night of the ball arrived, gilded and merciless. Carriages lined the palace gates, their lamps glittering like constellations. Inside, violins sang beneath chandeliers vast as suns. The perfume of lilies and candle wax clung to the air. Evelina followed the Countess through the throng, head bowed, heart pounding. She told herself she was invisible. But invisibility, she discovered, was fragile. Across the ballroom, laughter, low, familiar, cut through the music like a blade. Lord Cedric Ashbourne stood among a cluster of peers, resplendent in navy and gold, his expression smug with inherited charm. When his gaze found her, the years fell away, the humiliation at Pembroke's ball returned with cruel precision. He smiled as if fate itself conspired for his amusement. "Well," he said when she could no longer avoid him, "if it isn't the learned Miss Harbury. Or should I say the Duke's discarded muse?" His companions tittered. "Not married yet? Surely even the great philosopher must tire of solitude." Evelina steadied her breath. "You mistake my quiet for want, my lord. Some silences are chosen." Cedric's smile faltered. "Ah yes, the tragic governess who mistook pity for passion. Take comfort, England forgets quickly if one keeps her head bowed long enough." Before she could answer, the crowd stirred. The music paused, a herald's voice rose above the hum. "His Grace, the Duke of Wintreshire." The name struck through the hall like a bell. Conversation faltered, fans froze mid-motion. Evelina turned, her heart jolting violently within her chest. There he was, taller than memory, his uniform trimmed in midnight velvet, medals catching the light like small suns. He carried himself with the unflinching grace of command, yet his eyes searched the room not for royalty nor parliament, but for her. Whispers rippled through the assembly. Some murmured pity, others excitement. Cedric's smirk withered. "So the ghost returns?" he muttered, stepping back. The Duke moved through the crowd with measured strides, every step scattering expectation. The king himself extended a greeting, which the Duke acknowledged with impeccable formality before continuing past the throne dais. He did not stop until he stood before Evelina. The murmurs hushed to a single, collective intake of breath. "Miss Harbury," he said, bowing, not perfunctorily but deeply reverently as though before an equal. "I trust London has been kind." Her pulse trembled in her throat. "As kind as London remembers to be, Your Grace." A flicker of amusement touched his mouth. "Then it remembers poorly." He straightened, his presence commanding, the air itself bending around him. "Would you grant me the honor of a dance?" 1,000 eyes burned into her. The Dowager Countess gasped audibly. Cedric took a backward step, his face pale with disbelief. Evelina hesitated, knowing the weight this gesture carried. Acceptance would resurrect every whisper, refusal would wound him publicly. Yet in that instant, pride and fear seemed irrelevant. The world had already misjudged her. "Let it continue." She placed her gloved hand in his. "Yes, Your Grace." The orchestra resumed, the violins swelling like wine through an open gate. The Duke led her to the center of the floor and the waltz began. At first she moved stiffly, her breath shallow, but his hand at her back steadied her, firm, protective, unyielding. Around them, gossip churned like invisible fire, but within their small circle of movement, there was only the rhythm of shared heartbeat and forgiveness. "You should not have come," she murmured. "I came because I must," he replied. "A man cannot live beneath the weight of his own silence." "And your reputation?" "I traded it the day I let you walk away." The words burned through her restraint. She dared meet his eyes, finding not pride there, but something raw and human, gratitude, perhaps, or devotion. She realized then that all her fears of being his ruin had blinded her to his, that he too had been broken by judgment, bound by duty, and it was she who had freed him. When the final note faded, applause rippled weakly, uncertain whether to condemn or celebrate. The Duke did not release her hand. Instead, before the highest ranks of England, he sank to one knee. A collective gasp swept the hall. "Alexander," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Do not." "Evelina," he said, softly but clearly enough for all to hear. "I once believed love demanded permission from the world. I was wrong. It demands courage." The silence that followed was vast, sacred. Even the king seemed unwilling to interrupt. The Duke rose slowly, his expression calm, as though he had merely set down a burden carried too long. "You may despise me for this," he murmured near her ear, "but you will never again doubt your worth." And then, as if the world had paused for breath, applause began, not loud but tentative, spreading through the hall like dawn through mist. Faces that once turned away now watched with awe. Cedric's gaze fell, and the Countess clutched her pearls in shock. Evelina stood very still. She could feel the eyes of every gossip, every lord, every lady. Yet in her chest was peace, a trembling, impossible peace. She had not sought redemption, but somehow it had found her. Still she could not speak. The Duke looked at her once more, searching for an answer unspoken. Outside, snow began to fall, light, uncertain, as if testing the courage of its descent. Within the glittering hall, the orchestra resumed, and life pretended to continue. But Evelina knew nothing would ever be the same. For in the corner of her eye, she saw Lord Cedric slip quietly from the ballroom, his expression unreadable, and in that fleeting moment of retreat, she understood that the world's next act was already writing itself. Morning spilled across the fields of Wintreshire like pale gold silk, soft and newly woven. The winter had retreated at last, leaving behind the scent of thawed earth and wet lilacs. Within the great hall, preparations were already underway, servants moving like whispers, garlands being woven, the hush of expectancy alive in every corner. It was not a royal affair, nor a grand announcement. The Duke had refused both. "This house," he'd said, "has been haunted long enough by witnesses. Let joy enter quietly." Evelina stood before her mirror, the same mirror that once reflected her shame, now bathed in morning light. Her gown was not of diamonds or royal lace but of soft ivory muslin, its simplicity a statement of defiance against the glittering cruelty of the world that had mocked her. A small sprig of jasmine rested above her heart, his doing left without a word on her dressing table at dawn. It trembled faintly each time she drew breath. Through the open window she could hear distant laughter, Henry's laughter, as he ran with the hounds in the meadow. The boy had changed too, The sharp edges of solitude that once guarded his eyes had softened into brightness. When she thought of how gently the Duke had guided the boy's wounded spirit, how he'd guided hers without demanding return, she felt her throat tighten with gratitude so profound it hurt. A knock sounded, and Mrs. Greenfield, the housekeeper, entered. Her smile was maternal, proud. "They're waiting, my lady," she said softly, then paused, realizing the title that had slipped unbidden. Evelina only nodded. "Then let them wait a moment more." When she descended the staircase, the Duke was already at the base, dressed not in opulence but in the formal black of solemn vows. His hair caught the light like tempered steel. For a fleeting moment, she remembered the first day she'd seen him. Aloof, commanding, his presence like shadow against grandeur. Now that shadow had softened into something human, something she dared to call peace. Their eyes met halfway. He did not move to bow, nor she to curtsy. Instead, the world seemed to still around them as though even the walls knew reverence. "You look," he said quietly, "as though you belong to this house." "I belong only where I am trusted," she answered. "Then I shall never give you cause to wander." The vows were spoken beneath the painted archway of the grand foyer, witnessed by only a handful. Henry, radiant as sunlight, the Countess who had at last come to offer forgiveness in silence, and the vicar, his voice trembling as though he sensed history being rewritten before his eyes. When the Duke placed the ring upon Evelina's hand, the weight of it was less metal than meaning. Her name was spoken not with possession but promise. Yet even in that joy, a quiet unease stirred within her, the knowledge that peace in England was never unobserved. She felt it again as the great doors opened and the wind carried in the faint murmur of hooves. Outside, beyond the frost-glittered drive, a carriage approached bearing the unmistakable crest of Lord Cedric Ashbourne. Whispers moved like smoke through the hall. The Duke's expression hardened. His hand found hers, steady and sure. "Let him come," he said, voice calm but edged with finality. "We have lived too long in other men's shadows." Cedric entered without waiting to be announced. His fine cloak was splattered with mud, his once perfect posture touched by something more human, remorse or perhaps desperation. His eyes darted from the Duke to Evelina, then faltered under the weight of her composure. "So it's true," he said, his voice hoarse. "You mean to wed her?" The Duke regarded him evenly. "You are late for the ceremony, Ashbourne. The vows are already spoken." Cedric's jaw tightened. "Then perhaps you should hear mine. I came not for her, but for what your union has made of me. They laugh at me now, the man who mocked the Duchess of Wintreshire. They call it justice." Evelina's voice, calm and low, broke the tension. "It is justice, but it need not be punishment." He looked at her then, not with malice, but with the weary eyes of a man who had lost his reflection somewhere along the way. "You are merciful, my lady. I did not come to beg. Only to understand how I mistook brilliance for pride, and warmth for ambition." "You were raised to believe love was a transaction," she said. "We were all raised poorly in that regard." Cedric laughed softly, bitterly. "And what did you gain then? You think they will forget? That the tongue will forgive?" The Duke's voice filled the hall, quiet yet unarguable. "We do not ask forgiveness from those who have never known love." For a heartbeat no one spoke. Then Cedric removed his hat, his defiance extinguished. "Then I wish you both the courage I lacked." With that, he turned and strode out into the waiting rain, his figure swallowed by mist. When the echo of hooves had faded, silence reclaimed the hall. Evelina's hand trembled faintly in the Duke's, but he only smiled, the kind of smile that makes vows unnecessary. "London will write another story tomorrow," he said. "Let them. This one is ours." The afternoon passed in quiet celebration, no fanfare, no glittering crowd. Henry presented Evelina with a small book he had bound himself, its cover clumsy but endearing. "So you never forget us if you ever travel away," he said. She pressed a kiss to his hair and whispered, "My heart will not fit in a book, Henry, but if it did, it would live here." Later, as the sun lowered beyond the hills, the Duke led her to the gardens. Snowdrops pushed through the thawed soil, fragile but defiant. "Do you regret any of it?" he asked. "Regret?" She shook her head. "I regret only how long I believed my worth was theirs to measure." He took her hands in his. "You have rebuilt more than my home, Evelina. You have given it breath. And you," she said softly, "have given me the right to stand unbowed." They walked along the marble path until the first stars began to tremble above the horizon. The world around them felt suspended between two eras, the cruel, glittering one they had left behind, and the tender, uncertain one they had built together. Inside, the servants lit the lamps, their glow spilling through the windows like captured dawn. The air smelled faintly of jasmine. The Duke stopped near the stone fountain, its waters reflecting starlight, and turned toward her. "I once believed love was a battlefield," he murmured. "Now I know it is the surrender that saves us." Evelina smiled, her eyes glistening with tears she did not hide. "Then surrender, my love, and let the world bear witness to peace." He kissed her hands, then her brow, and for the first time since the war he laughed, quietly, freely, as if the sound itself might banish ghosts. She laughed with him, her voice like wind through glass. The night deepened. Inside, the great clock struck 8, and the last of the guests departed, leaving only the murmur of the fire. Evelina stood at the doorway watching the snow fall once more, soft, unhurried, as if the heavens themselves offered their blessing. She felt no bitterness now toward the city that once shamed her, only a distant pity for its blindness. Behind her, the Duke's voice came low, steady, filled with warmth. "When I first saw you, you were the only flame in a house of shadows. I feared it would burn me. Instead, it taught me how to live." She turned, smiling through quiet tears. "And I feared love would destroy me. Instead, it restored me to myself." He drew her close, and their foreheads touched. The fire crackled, the snow thickened, the world fell away. Far beyond Wintreshire, in the clubs and parlors of London, Cedric Ashbourne raised his glass to a portrait newly hung in a gallery, the Duchess of Wintreshire, serene and unyielding. "You won, Evelina," he whispered. "And you taught us what victory truly costs." Back at the estate, beneath a sky scattered with stars, the Duke and Duchess stood hand in hand. The bells from the distant chapel tolled softly, their echo fading into night. And in that stillness, the narrator's voice seemed to breathe once more through time. "For every woman mocked for her silence, and every man broken by grief, there comes a moment when dignity becomes its own rebellion, and love, at last, its quiet reward."